it is quite fitting to have Dr. Miller here on National Doctors Day, and he's also our grand finale for the lecture series this year, which was titled Had I Known. Had I known, ... And then every speaker who was here for the series filled in that blank. So this is our grand finale, and Dr. Miller is going to be unpacking Had I Known for you today. And before that, I'm going to give a brief biography. So let's get to the good stuff. Let's talk about Dr. Miller, and then I'm going to introduce our program, and then I will move on to giving the floor to Dr. Miller, all right? Okay, so Dr. Miller received his medical degree from Ohio State University, and he spent 5 years at the University of California getting certified in internal medicine and radiation oncology. So Dr. Miller studies cancer, and he worked with cancer patients. That's what oncology means, all right? And so 43 years, he treated cancer patients as a field changed dramatically. If you imagine, most of you are in your 20s, so double that. Think how much your life has changed in 20 years, right? So Dr. Miller's been in the field for 43 years, and he's been a part of all of the change of oncology thus far, especially in terms of palliative care. He was heavily involved in medical ethics, medical education, and patient empowerment, and he served as the medical director of 3 cancer centers. And that was all the way until he retired. He retired quite recently. Dr. Miller continues to lecture frequently at hospital grand rounds, as well as the ASPEC, which is the Academy of Senior Professionals at Eckerd College. He focuses on aging wisely and how to maintain not only physical health, but also emotional health and spiritual health. He was a pioneer in the hospice movement, as well as development in the field of palliative medicine, where he was the founding member of the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine and served as the first national president. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Miller and have him here speaking for the communication department. And I can tell that some of you are new faces. I see Dr. Feifman and other professors in the room. So if you're interested in this type of talk, I want to do a short plug that this is the Department of Communication, and you can certainly come and talk to me about what that means at a later time, or send me an email. My name is Meredith Clements, and the email would be mclements@ut.edu. But enough about me. I want you to give a hand, please, to Dr. Miller.
All right, thank you. So even though I'm an old guy, and you're already saying, okay, what else, boomer, I try to be fairly connected. My son is Chief Project Director at Google Accelerated Science, so he's in charge of their quantum computer program, and his AI program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And my daughter went to Medill for journalism and then got a master's in there, so I stay connected. I was trying to play Minecraft with my grandson, and apparently I don't have that skill set. So when the lights went out, I said, I can't see. He says, put on your night goggles. I said, where do I find night goggles? He said, I told you, you right-click on the screen and your toolbox will come up. So I failed on Minecraft, even though I do try to keep up with AI and TensorFlow and some of the other things on AI, because it's you got to know this stuff. So even for an old guy, a boomer. So we'll start out on this whole thing. What have I learned on my journey? How have I funged it together? And what useful information can I share with the younger generation? And you start out with a grumpy old guy. George Bernard Shaw said, youth is wasted on the young. But you have people who are a little more kind to us when you were young. Wordsworth said, the child is the father of the man. And what he meant was that when you were little, your mind was perfect. You were just soaking in information without prejudice. The amount of stuff you could learn as an infant is unbelievable. If you study neuroscience, they usually will say, the brain, it only makes up 2% of our body mass, but it chews up 25% of the energy. It's like having an app in your iPhone that's killing the battery. But when you're a newborn, your brain's not even myelinated. In the first months or years, you're using 65% of your energy just on your brain. So our brain was our best. When we were young, we were at our best. And we ruin people with education. This school not counting, of course. But, and there's something, I think I'll get to it, but it's quite amusing to me. I don't know if you've ever heard this expression, but It's the bitter, the bitter lesson of AI. And so I'll start with the first part of the story. When my grandson was 3, his mom let him help her make cupcakes. And when I have a video of this, and when it came to frosting the cupcakes, he pushed her hand away and he said, "No, I'll do it my way." So 3-year-old, he'd never seen it before. He already had my way. And I said, well, this is classic toxic masculinity. He's already saying, "Don't tell me what to do, woman. I know." Now, so I was thinking, well, this isn't a good thing. But now this idea, the bitter lesson of AI, it turns out with machine learning, if you try to help the machine, you do worse. They do better if you just have unabridged, just let it learn itself. The computer, AlphaGo, the one that beat the world's greatest Go player. You know, he had 1 million examples from the best, but then he played himself 1 billion times and blew everybody out. So I say this only to say, when we were young, we were at our best. And when you're talking to yourself, which I talk to myself all the time, talk to the child inside and keep that person alive. You will be happier and healthier. So, and this thing, Rumi was a poet in the Middle Ages. Yesterday I was clever and wanted to change the world. Today I'm wise, so I'm changing myself. Now, how do you avoid being smarter and smarter without getting more and more arrogant and cocky the whole time? And it's a simple math problem. Is all you do is realize every time you learn something, that's the numerator, but there's a denominator that's growing faster. So when I was 8, I thought I was really smart. So my mother had said, "You're really smart, eh?" I said, "Yes, I am." "How much do you know?" "I must know 10 really important things." "How many do you think there are in the world?" "Maybe 12 or 13. So she said, "Well, you're almost there. You are smart." Now, as you get older, you realize every time I learn 10 new things, I realize there's now 100 or 1,000 I haven't even gotten to yet. In fact, I haven't even thought about them. So my numerator may be getting bigger. You're getting smarter. But your denominator should be growing faster and faster. That's all the stuff. We are a work in progress, all the stuff you're going to learn. So if you do that, you can get smarter without getting arrogant and complacent. So just a little biographical stuff, what it was like to grow up in the boomers. So, you know, in the 1950s, virtually everybody watched Walter Cronkite. It was a very monochromatic, black and white, very simple world. Surveys showed he was the most trusted man in America. So whatever Uncle Walter said, everybody believed. And so this is a 1950s mindset. This is actually, I think, pretty actually captures it. So very simple time where everyone with scare quotes, agreed with the rules and social roles. Everyone, again with quotes, trusted the authority figures, whatever the politicians, religious leaders, celebrities, parents said, to guide them and reveal the truth about history and our place in the universe. We won the big one, World War II, and we were the greatest, and it must be because we deserve to be the greatest. It was good times for all. Well, as long as you were a white male living in a middle-class family and conformed to all the accepted social norms, of course it was great. And DeSantis, our governor, will love this picture. There were no gay people in the 1950s. And so everybody had very simple-minded roles. So she would be a secretary, he would be the boss, she would be a nurse, he would be a doctor, he would be a businessman, she would be a secretary or a school teacher. That was and most people didn't really think to challenge that. So this was the 1950s. If there were any people not participating in the fun, it was just probably their own fault. So I throw this out only to give you an idea how far I've had to come from my upbringing or education. So the war ends 1945. My father comes home from the Pacific. He had so much trouble with the Depression and the war getting any college, and he was already 28. He thought he was too old to go back to college. So 1945, he meets my mother. She's a telephone operator putting little buttons in. They get married in 46. Between 47, my sister's born, 48, my brother, 49, I was born on my brother's birth date. 51, my next brother was born. Before my mother was done, she had 8 children in the next 10 years. She used to kid me and say, you know, Robert, that left me with a weak brain and a weak bladder. And I said, Mother, unfortunately, you're right about both. So, but that was the 50s. So in the 50s, you were trying to learn the accepted orthodoxy, fit into a civilized society. But then the good news, I spent the 60s trying to reject all the values of squares in the hopes of becoming cool, substituting one group of discredited authorities with even more dubious role models, you know, the rock and rollers and that crowd. So it was fun, and those of us who lived through that, it was great fun. And so then you finally settle down. So here I was in college. This was my med school ID. That was the best mustache I could grow in those days. We'll come back to that in a second. Then my wife made me shave it off because she wanted me to look clean cut as a young doctor. So very young and earnest. And then when I was an actual real doctor, an RD we call it, a real doctor, it was fun to get along with the patients, et cetera, et cetera. So my first good job when I was in pre-med at college was a hospital orderly. And I'd recommend that to anybody, probably the best job I ever had. And it paid me a lot of money in those days, $2.70 an hour. And because the previous summer I was getting $1.25 as a gardener, and I complained to my old man and said, you know, that's a little low, don't you think? He said he got 10 cents an hour working in celery swamps back in the Depression. So $2.70 an hour was a pretty good deal, and you really got comfortable dealing with nurses, sick patients, talking to people. So I learned a ton just being a hospital orderly. And then med school at Ohio State, that was interesting, that was fun. Now in those days there was a doctor shortage, so if you're willing to go to med school and go straight on through, you can get out of med school in 3 years. And so today I have a son-in-law who's an ER doc, and he went to med school, University of Oregon, and it took him 5 years because he had to take some time. And so, not to pick on younger people, but in the old days, we just run right on through. So, and then San Francisco was the coolest place to live, particularly in the 70s. And UCSF is really the medical complex, for UC Berkeley. So UC Berkeley, of course, is famous for all the scientists during World War II and building up to the nuclear bombs and all that stuff. A lot of physicists and Nobel laureates at Berkeley. So UCSF, we went over to Berkeley to run the heavy particle machine to bombard tumors. And then Stanford had the first medical linear accelerator, so we rotated through Stanford. So it was a really cool place for high tech. So I guess what I'm trying to lead up to is you had, you had to have three things spinning at the same time. Science, dealing with people who are dying or not, and then dealing with your own issues related to that. And what I'm trying to lead you towards is the notion you can do all three at the same time, but how are you going to do that? So, and then when you get into private practice, again, everything was changing all the time. When I started out, we had old cobalt machines, and the x-rays in those days, there was no CT and MRI until the mid-70s. So you'd have a cobalt machine, and you shine it, somebody had cancer in there somewhere. I hope I'm on the right spot. By the time I finished, we had the first, in this area, Tampa Bay, CyberKnife and Gamma Knife. And a CyberKnife is literally a linear accelerator attached to a robot. And what the robot can do, if you put a marker on the person's body, as they're breathing in and out and their organs are moving, the robot starts timing it. You can actually see the robot arm timing with the breathing motion. And so when it's time to blast the cancer in the lung or the pancreas, it says, I got it, and boom, it shoots it. So that kind of technology from where I started was just, amazing. And then the final thing, patients' rights and patients' ability to make decisions, the hospice movement started. So in the 70s, when medical technology was booming, we were getting pushback. A lot of people thought that doctors were treating people way past the point that made no sense. So patients' right, hospice movement came up. It turned out when I came to St. Pete in '79, that one of the largest hospices in the world was in Pinellas County. So I was on the board and then joined the National Hospice Organization and then decided we needed to form a whole specialty called palliative medicine, which didn't exist. So we started a group, and I was the first national president, and it was great fun because literally we were reinventing the word palliation, reinventing the word terminal. And so that was fun. So if you said, okay, in the 53 years I worked in a hospital till I retired, 67 to 20, what did I really learn? If you break it into those three topics. So one, you have to be a lifelong learner. I mean, when I graduated med school, the dean did say, I hope you learn, we taught you guys how to self-educate. Because he said, in 10 years, 90% of what you will know, you'll have to pick up on your own. And now that's even accelerated. So lifelong learner, I think you all know that you got to do that. Everything you know is incomplete or probably wrong altogether and constantly changing. Is that a new idea? No, not really. The ancient Greeks said, no man steps in the same river twice. We're living in a world of dynamic changes. Everything's changing. Okay, so that's reality. Then how about people, the patients? So again, there's no average patient, even though we use statistics to get an average sense of what to expect. Everybody's unique, not only medically, but emotionally. And if you start forming a healing relationship, it's a negotiated sharing of roles. And so this sounds obvious to you, but this was a new concept. You probably wouldn't believe this, but in 1961, they did a survey of doctors and said, if a patient has cancer, do you tell them? And overwhelmingly, doctors said, oh, no, I wouldn't tell them that. Now, in fairness to those doctors, the treatment for cancer was pretty bleak in the 50s. But the idea that you wouldn't even tell, only 12% of doctors in 1961 said they would even tell the poor patient, oh, by the way, you've got cancer. They wouldn't even tell them. By 1978, they repeated that survey. Now 98% of doctors would tell the patient. But the idea that you as a patient didn't even have a right to know, that's crazy. So if you have, but what's interesting, obviously, when you deal, I had lots of patients who would want to know everything, patients who want to know nothing. I had an older woman, old Southern belle. I come up to her room, and she said, before you say anything, don't say anything. You got to talk to my son, Bo. I said, okay. So I said, who's Bo? And he's got a medical background. So it turns out he worked at a tattoo parlor once. So I talked to Bo. I said, well, Bo, your mom's been smoking 3 packs of Camels, since she was a teenager. She's got this big lung cancer, so we can't cut it out. We think we should try to radiate it. So Bo, cogitated on this and gave us the go-ahead. But the woman every day would come down to a department, had a big sign that said Cancer Center. Lay in her machine. We had this purple drawing on her chest to get treatment. She would never let us tell her what was going on, and that was her way of dealing with that. And the other thing you'll learn if you deal with patients, some are nice people, some are awful people. And you have to learn how to insulate yourself from toxic people. And so you have to develop a sense of humor. I had a guy once, he comes in to see me. He says, kind of an old redneck sort of guy. He says, I'll tell you right now. He says, I fired the last 6 doctors I had, but I heard you were supposed to be good, so I'm going to give you a try. So my internal voice is saying, oh, well, good. Well, let's see how far we go in this relationship before I become number 7. So with patients like that, I jump right to it, make it very simple and say, now what can I do to help you? How can I be of service? So he said, well, he's got something wrong. Nobody seems to know what it is. And it turns out with 1 second you could figure the story. He was a heavy smoker. He had obvious lung cancer. He had refused to let anybody get a biopsy and find out. So I carefully explained it. I said, we need a biopsy to make sure it's cancer and what type. So he finally agreed. I put the biopsy date on my schedule, so as soon as it was done, I could check it and call him. So I call him, and he only lived a few blocks from the hospital. This is over at St. Anthony's. I said, why don't you come in, Harry, we'll talk about this. And he said, well, you can tell me over the phone. He said, I'm not coming all the way down there unless you tell me. It was like 6 blocks. I said, well, okay. So I said, unfortunately, it did show what we talked about is you've got lung cancer. He says, cancer? I said, yes. He said, well, that's a hell of a thing to tell somebody over the phone. He said, what kind of doctor are you? You're fired. And he hung up. And I never heard from him again. I don't know if he got treated or not. So I was number 7. So the point of these stories are everybody is different. And people have a right to make good and bad choices. And if you're a caregiver, whatever relationship you have in your life with other people, they may try, there are toxic people, they may try to get to you. People know how to get to you. And so, I'll come back to this point. You have to know how to insulate yourself from toxic people. And then the final one, and then the relationship changes as the disease changes. I mean, sad to say, I had lots of patients who were doctors. Many of them were friends of mine. Some did okay, but a lot of them didn't do okay. And early on, they would want to go through the pictures, and we would discuss it as a team. But as it got worse and worse, at the end, I said, do you want to see the new things? And they said, no, you just, take over. So the relationship changes. And then finally, then you have to look at yourself in the mirror and say, what's your role in this relationship? Are you keeping yourself healthy? Are you remembering it's the patient is the one who's sick? There's a lot of doctors that get burnt out. And it's actually very tricky when you think about that. How much of a relationship should you have with the patient? Some people have a good cry with their patient if things are really bleak. Is that what they want or expect from their doctor? I mean, these things, there's no simple answer to that. But so, as I take everything I ever learned and break it into 3 topics, I'll give you my theory on how you should approach this yourself. So, and again, just to summarize, so I grew up simple worldview, later realized that everything was crude and distorted sense of reality. So I moved along with some successes and some failures, teachable moments, picked up some favorite quotes. I have 1 million of my favorite quotes and ideas along the way, but I never really attempted to incorporate that into a coherent life plan. So what's the whole plan here? What's the goal? What is your purpose? And so I'm doing that now, but frankly, until I was retired and had more time to really read a lot more broadly, it didn't occur to me to try to pull this together. So this was something I saw on the internet. It's a meme, a mediocre philosopher. His whole insight is, good enough. Because I had a friend who worked in the government, was a radiation doctor. When it was his day to check the films to make sure they were accurate, he would say, close enough for government work. Just put an X on it, which wasn't reassuring. So this is what I'm going for. But in my defense, as a mediocre philosopher, I really only have one student, which is me. And you only have one student, that's you. And so you just have to say, because I'm the only one who cares what I think or say. So if you solve this problem for yourself, and just say, but I am willing to share. If I've learned anything and somebody asks my opinion, I'd be happy to tell it to them. So that's what you want to do. And so, now this slide I probably should have left out. My kids would say, TMI, Dad, too much information. You're boring people. This slide is you may as well stick an ice pick in your eye rather than look at this thing. I included it mainly so I could show you Friedrich Nietzsche's mustache. So that's what I was going for. But if you knew these 11 topics, which should take you about 50 years to learn this, you would have a better sense of where I'm going for this. But so existentialism, Nietzsche was famous for saying a lot of things. One of them was God is dead. And basically he wasn't happy about that. He said, scientific revolution pulled the plug on all the science that we thought we needed God for. And then the Enlightenment said, we can really rule ourselves. We don't need, emperors. And, he said, that's the good news. The bad news now, you're on your own. You got to figure this out. And then Sartre and Camus, the more well-known existentialists in the 30s and 40s really developed that. But I think the reason we're struggling as a society is most people, they're happy to reject. You don't have to get up and go to church on Sunday. But they haven't really substituted, well then what is the point? I mean, what is meaning? What gives me meaning? So that's something you have to come to your own. Complex system theory, I love that. Complexity theory, everything in life is a complex system. Everything is interdynamic and changing constantly, and it creates what's called emergent property. This is a huge field. Is all you need to know right now is everything is more complicated than you thought. Quantum field theory, everybody's heard of quantum mechanics. And as Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, said, nobody understands it. So why am I telling you to spend time on learning quantum mechanics? Well, because we're living in a quantum world. We're going to have a quantum computer pretty soon. And people who are trying to cheat you will add the word quantum to everything. Well, this is a quantum, watch. This is a quantum this. So, and the beauty of if you attempt to learn quantum mechanics and Schrodinger's cat, what exactly is that? You will find that you can't quite get that. So it teaches a little humility that you're not capable of getting into the real oomph of quantum mechanics. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, it's the most successful psychotherapy. The only reason it's worth knowing that is it works. And what's the whole point of cognitive behavior therapy? Cognition. The reason we're so screwed up is we have stupid ways of thinking. And so if you look up cognitive distortions or cognitive traps in Wikipedia, you'll find there's 100 of them. It keeps growing. So affirmation bias and confirmation bias and all these things that we're all guilty of, they're all in there. If you look at all this, cognitive traps and distortions, we all have them. And while you're in there, also flip over to the other page of Wikipedia, and let's see, look at logical fallacies. That, again, we're all guilty of these. You're not thinking straight. And so cognitive behavior therapy and logical fallacies and all this is to try. Now, and is this new information? You said, did you just make that up? And the answer is no, there was a guy who nailed this. Oh yeah, his name was the Buddha. That was 400, 500 BC. He nailed it. There's another guy who nailed this 300 BC, the Greek philosopher who started Stoicism. He nailed it. And then the Romans in the first century nailed that. So this is not new information. You make yourself unhappy. You make yourself crazy. So CBT is where that's at. Evolutionary biology and psychology, I have a slide on that. I'll come back to that because that's really, at least you should know something. Positive psychology was a whole new field that started 30 years ago. Instead of psychologists listing all the diseases, list all the ways they can make us happy and flourish and focus on that. Hormesis, none of you probably ever heard of that word, but this brings me back to my friend Nietzsche. One of his other most famous quotes was, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." So hormesis is actually now the biological fact that if you stress a person, you make them healthier. So you have to know what kind of stresses. But there are pathways in your DNA called longevity pathways. If you stress yourself, like fasting. Fasting is good for you. Cold baths, good for you. Certain types of stress will activate your longevity pathways and make you healthier and live longer. So again, it's a younger generation. If you read Jonathan Haidt's book about the coddling of the American mind, instead of making younger people even more resilient, there's increasing fragility. This idea of protecting you from everything. So when I was 9 years old, I was a paper boy, I had a paper route. Get on my little bike at 5:45 and pedal out in these dark streets, delivering a paper. And so when I was older, I said to my mother, I said, that might have been dangerous. She says, I said, weren't you afraid of losing me? And she said, that's why I had extras. I mean, she had 8 kids. She didn't need all of us. So now I got to admit, as much as I can make fun of younger people and say, well, you're a helicopter parent, you got to let the child grow. But when I'm babysitting my grandchildren, I got to admit, I don't let them out of my sight. I don't want their picture to show up on a milk carton the next day or an Amber Alert. So I don't know how to work that. You'll have to figure that out yourself if you become a parent. How not to make your children, more and more and more fragile. Genetics versus epigenetics. If you don't know this expression, if I said to you, well, epigenetics trumps genetics. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, you're way behind on genetics. So that field is just insane. You need to catch up. So modern neuroscience and artificial intelligence. Again, you all know about what's going on in that, so I'll come back to that in a second. Exponential growth of information technology, that's something you should know. And I got a separate slide, I'll develop that in a second. And then a secular view of ethics and moral psychology, the reason we're fighting with each other and politically polarized is if you know you're morally right, there's no way you can even listen to somebody who has a different opinion of yours. So you accuse them, that's a false moral equivalency. Or you're just trying to pull a whataboutism on me. I can't stand this person. And, there's no room for debate. There's no room to be very calm and debate. And you need to study this whole concept. So Jonathan Haidt writes very convincingly on that subject. But evolutionary psychology, this is worth knowing a lot because, like it or not, we've evolved over millions or billions of years. And so I would take no credit or blame for my evolutionary legacy. So, and if it works for you, good. If it works bad for you, it's called an evolutionary mismatch, or I just call it evolutionary baggage. So it's not your job to feel guilty or to take credit. If you're really tall, well, look how tall I grew. Well, you don't get credit for that. But it is your responsibility to understand the influences this has on you. So if you have fat genes, if your ancestors grew up in an environment where they had to grow fat genes to hang on to every calorie, and now you live in an obesogenic environment like we do, you're going to get fat. So, there's tons of data now on all these fat genes that have been discovered. So you can moan and groan, it's not my fault, but you have to understand this and realize if you don't want to get heavy or diabetic or whatever, you're going to have to deal with it. It's well demonstrated that the skin coloration is related to the ultraviolet radiation in the latitude on the planet where your ancestors came. And I did 23andMe, and it said my ancestors left Eastern Africa 43,000 years ago and settled in Ireland. And in those 43,000 years, they lowered their pigment down to get enough vitamin D because they needed more vitamin D. If you get too much UV, it wipes out your folic acid, so you get darker. If you have too much melanin in your skin and you're in a high latitude, you lower your melanin to get vitamin D. Both of those affect your evolution. So 43,000 years ago, these wise guys did that. Now I have fair skin. Now I moved to Florida, and if I go out in the sun, I get a basal cell. And so if I'm complaining to somebody, I don't know who wants to hear my sad story, I just want to play in the sun like everybody else, the answer is deal with it. So I do. I put sunscreen and big hats to stay out of the sun. So does that make sense? So the whole point is worth knowing about this. If you have fat genes, American Indians, have a lot of fat genes evolutionary-wise, so they have a problem with diabetes and other diseases. We want to help them, but we need to know why they're having this problem. And then this is another slide. You should all understand this. So technology grows exponentially. So you probably heard of Moore's Law. Moore just died a few days ago. He was the guy who said that the amount of transistors we can squeeze on a microchip will double every year or two. So doubling means it's growing exponentially. So the issue is technology grows exponentially, but our adaptability grows linearly. We can get a little smarter every year, but we can't double it. And so Thomas Friedman, who I like a lot, Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, who writes a lot of books, this was his last book. He had this graph. He said the problem is human adaptability, we're chugging along at our own sweet pace. Technology has now blown along and has probably already gone past us. This is a few years ago. So he said most of us are like rum-dums. We're sitting there on this little blue line, and somebody looks up and says, hey, what's that little white thing going all the way up in the distance? And the guy said, you don't think we missed our train, do you? And he said, yeah, that's the train where all the smart people are, and we missed it. Well, this was this book a couple years ago. Now that white line is so far up there, the technology is growing so fast and so smart that if you don't know how you're going to get back on the train, you're in a heap of trouble. So I'll come back to that in a second, but this really affects all of your lives more than me. So this was Thomas Friedman, a very well-known writer. So he got his hands not on ChatGTP, but the good one, GTP4. He said it was so demoralizing he couldn't sleep that night. So he wrote this in the New York Times. He called it a Promethean moment. Prometheus was the Greek god who gave us fire, changed the world. So he says everything is going to have to change, everything. And so I thought about what I can share, my knowledge. Is there anything I have that was scalable? So my great-uncle DJ graduated from med school 1888. His daughter was a doctor, inherited his stuff, but she died without children, so I inherited Uncle DJ's stuff. So when I look through and I have his microscope in his old black bag, it's fun, there's some of his old books. And so how much useful information do I get out of his books? None, zero, nothing, nada. Okay, so how about Dr. Bob here? How much retained value is left in all my years of wisdom? Anything? Is it going to disappear? Is it going to disintegrate like Uncle DJ? So you have to say, what have I learned that I can reformat in a concept that's of any value to anybody? If I brought in all my wisdom on a 5 1/4 floppy disk and say, hey, where do I put this floppy disk? And they say, we'll have to go on eBay and say we could even find one of those anymore. So how do you reformat what you know or not know in something that will help anybody? And my first insight into this whole thing is this. The most useful idea I can say is the realization all knowledge is connected. So life is a jigsaw puzzle. You got little puzzles and pieces. You got to figure out how to put it together. Or life is a Sherlock Holmes detective story. And those little clues are telling you something, and you got to figure out how to put that together. But there's two problems here. One, first you need to have to find the clues, but then you have to find out, is the information I have accurate? It's the field of epistemology. Are you an expert on how to know, signal from noise, junk from fake news, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And so, as you well know, it's getting harder and harder. How do you verify that? So you need two skill sets. You need to first verify, am I getting good stuff? And two, how am I going to combine this? What are the little clues and tips? If I could think about my life or the world that way. I had a patient. He was an old MAGA kind of character. So just for my amusement, I said, so, Henry, I said, where do you get your information from? Do you watch news? What news shows do you watch? He says, I don't watch any of them. It's all fake news, all fake news. I said, okay. He said, but I'll tell you something you might not know. I said, all right, school me. He says, do you know when Obama was president, he changed the law, so if you were born here, you were not automatically a citizen. I said, Obama changed that law? Yes. I said, well, that's funny. I said, I would have thought that would be in the Constitution. I said, let me think. I think that's the 14th Amendment. Well, he said he never heard of that. He didn't know. They didn't think they went up that high because the only one he ever heard of was the Second Amendment. Because the NRA talks about that all day long. So initially he was thrown off his game, but he said, well, listen, it don't matter. I said, okay. He said, because the good news, when Trump was in, he changed the law back. So now it's not true that being born here, you're a citizen, which of course is nonsense. I said, well, okay. I said, well, it's good to know that. So I said to him, so, for a man who doesn't watch any news, you seem very well informed. And he said, then he smiled and said, well, I listen to a lot of talk radio. I said, well, it really shows. I mean, there you go. Now, whenever I tell that story, my very liberal friends say, well, no, that's no good. You missed an opportunity to straighten this guy out. I would have pinned his ears back. And so, and you can argue whether that, I said, well, actually my job is to help this poor guy get through his cancer treatments. He didn't come to me for political advice. I don't think he would get it if I tried to say anything intelligent anyway, so let's just move on. But, the truth is we're all struggling with, fake news, etc. So if you map this out, there's three things. If you want to get out of the matrix and take the red pill, you're going to have to re-examine what's my relationship with reality, other people in society, and the man in the mirror, the person you see every day. Now, some people would look at this and say, hey, you left out God. Some people say, your core relationship includes God. Some people only have one thing, relationship with God. Let Jesus take the wheel. And if that works for you, that's fine. I've been lecturing on the whole field of psychology and positive psychology and happiness. And if you look up the statistics, the parts of the world that are most happy are not religious. Scandinavia, those countries. I had a nurse from Denmark. I said, well, people in Denmark, do you have any religion or God? Nope. I said, well, what do you think happens when you die? She said, nobody knows. That was fine. For her, it worked perfectly. On the other hand, I have a lot of friends who are psychologists and psychiatrists, and if you're dealing with people who are depressed or unhappy, the first question to ask, did you grow up in a religious environment? And if they say yes, then you should say, well, go back to church. If you get involved with your church and community, you will be happier. So I'm willing to say both of those make perfect sense to me, and you'd have to decide for yourself. All right, so reality, do you have a relationship with reality? And I do like this guy, Ray Kurzweil, who's a little controversial, you might say. But he's a futurologist, and he's been very good on computer science and the growth of technology. So, but again, reality, like it or not, it's real. There is a reality out there. This probably isn't all just, an imaginary game we're living in. It's in the name.
And the reality, if it's there, it's indifferent to your desires and demands. It is. You might say, I don't acknowledge gravity. I deny gravity. Well, if you step off a building, you're going to find out. So, and reality is more complicated than you figured, and we'll probably never understand it. And Kurzweil's point is this artificial knowledge is growing so fast, your brain is limited. It's never going to catch up. And sometime, again, maybe in your lifetime, not mine, you will have to make the decision, do you want to go out the way God made you, organic, or do you want to let them give you the nanoparticles that will wire your brain into the cloud so you can merge with this, become a Borg, merge with this cosmic reality, et cetera, That may happen in your lifetime. And so you may have a big decision to make. The other thing I like, another guy I like a lot, E.O. Wilson. So he was the world's greatest ant expert, Harvard biology professor, famous for a lot of things. And you'd say, I'm pretty sure I'm not interested in ants. But what his notion, again, he's one of my models on how all knowledge is connected. So by looking at how ants, he said, well, you don't judge an ant by himself. You judge him by his group, by his society. They're superorganisms. So we're part of a society. We should, consider ourselves individuals, but also part of a society. So, and so I like two of his quotes. People would rather believe than know. Most people would be happy, give me some kind of answer so I can stop. It's very hard for people to accept things they don't know. If you think of a child, we'll keep saying, well, Daddy, why does this happen? Okay, well, where does that happen? They're not happy unless you can give them a simple answer. The first time you ever saw a movie as a kid that didn't have a simple, happy ending, you were probably very disappointed. The movie just ends and you don't know if the guy lived or died or what happened. So that's very unsettling when you're young and you want people to wrap this up in a nice little package. Well, the real world isn't that way. So, and this quote I think says it perfectly. The real problem with humanity is we have Paleolithic emotions, this caveman thing. We have medieval institutions that don't really work. They were compromises. Even the Constitution was a bad compromise, including slavery and federalism in different states to try to hold this thing together. We're still struggling because of those compromises. And we have no godlike technology. So you have cavemen with bad organization. Look at how dysfunctional Congress is. So, again, concerning. So not to leave you depressed, the way I look at reality is this. You want to visualize yourself a cork floating on the open sea. You're just floating along. You're not trying to fight the waves or the weather. You're not trying to judge other people, complain, make demands. You're floating along. Like Wordsworth's famous saying, I wandered lonely as the cloud and came upon these daffodils. You're either the cloud or the daffodils. You're just floating along and soaking up reality. Or Thoreau, you can get so much value, knowledge, very calmly from nature, art, music, humor, puppies, God's greatest creation, dogs. You can get everything you need from that. And Thoreau's famous quote, it's not what you look at that matters, it's what you see. So you need to become this Zen master, very calmly hearing everything, learning everything. Everything you hear, you say, I wonder if that's factual or not. If it is, I may add that to my little Irish stew of information that I'm collecting. So that's your reality relationship. That's what it should look like. And you're just a cork floating along. You're not angry. You're not upset. You're not getting worked up. My staff at my cancer centers, I said, you're going to have patients who are just awful to you. You're trying to do everything you can to help them, and they're complaining and accusing you of mistreating them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't pay for you to get worked up and emotional and mad and get angry. I said, imagine if somebody insulted you in a language you didn't understand. Would you get upset? I don't think so. So why get upset because you do understand it? So if somebody insults me or says something ugly, is all I think is they've just revealed something about themselves, nothing about me. They've just revealed this person's an idiot, he's a jerk, he's a bigot, he's a this, he's a that. And I'm thinking, I wonder if he realizes how much he's given away. So you can do that. You might say, well, that's kind of hard to do. No, you can do that. So if you're a doctor, the first thing when you go into med school and you go into the OR, you are petrified when they cut somebody open. You're going to either faint or throw up. And so there was a Seinfeld episode where they opened somebody and they dropped a mint inside the person's body. Anybody watch Seinfeld anymore? But anyway, so you're petrified as a med student. Well, I hope I don't faint or pass out. All right. So you become desensitized. And so you can do that with ugly people or toxic personalities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You just have to decide you want to do that. So that brings the next important thing. What's your relationship with other people? That's critical. And the simplest rules are just to say other people matter and future people count. So they're there. We're evolved to be part of a social group, like it or not. And so you need to be part of a social group, not only be successfully materially. The only reason we beat the saber-toothed tiger or animals that were tougher and stronger or maybe even smarter is we form groups. That's one. And your own mental well-being needs to be part of something. Now again, the best person you may ever know in your life who really loves you is your dog. And so it may not be your parents or your family or anybody else. Who knows? But you need to be connected. So the best advice, there was Clinton, you guys may not remember the fiasco Clinton got in with Monica Lewinsky and all these scandals. And there was a funny quote, he didn't say it, but it was said, the 11th commandment of Bill Clinton. And it was, thou shalt not judge. He figured, hey, let's just not throw stones at anybody, particularly me. So I modified that and I say, well, thou shalt not conceptualize. And by that I mean try not to judge each other and put you into a category and conceptualize. Well, you're pretty but not as pretty as this person. You're smart but not as smart as this person. You're probably a good person, but you don't do that. You don't have to rate everything. There's a lot of criticism now of colleges where they have to rank everything. U.S. News and Report rankings. Is that really good? It's important to know who's the richest man in America. Zillow is a disaster because now all these people look up each other's house to see, is their house worth more than my house? I mean, it's horrible. Somebody made a great comment about that. They said the 7 deadly sins, the only one you never enjoy is envy. If you have gluttony, at least until you get on the scale, you had a great time stuffing yourself. But not envy. As soon as you start envying anybody, you go on Instagram or Facebook, they've got a nicer house than mine. They've got cuter kids than mine. They've got this, that, they've got, I must be a loser. What's wrong? So envy is horrible. You need to avoid it. So, and we could collectively change the world, but only if it makes sense, if we do it together in a way that benefits us all. So this is a great quote. You see this all the time. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Perfect. So some of these little caveats are all you need. And so there are areas of uncertainty. Do we need to tend to ourselves first? You'll see this quote. Please put your oxygen mask on before attempting to assist others. So do you come first? Or how about your loved ones rank higher than total strangers? If there's only a couple kidneys to go around for donations, am I going to push my kid in before everybody else? And do we have responsibility to other people injured in the past by someone other than ourselves? So, and what Clinton did say a lot, he started this and then I did like Obama, he followed up a lot. He would say something like this, we need a conversation on race. We need a conversation on equity. We need a conversation on fairness. So I'm a smart guy, I could do this on my own, but it means nothing. It has to be we as a society very calmly sit down and say, let's talk about if this makes sense. All right, so that's other people. And then finally, the man in the mirror, the person you look at every day. And hopefully you figured this out by now. The best friend you ever had and the worst enemy you ever going to have is the person you see in the mirror every morning when you brush your teeth. The person who could do the most to help you and wants to help you in all this is you, but the person who keeps making stupid decisions and getting you in trouble constantly is you, and you figure that's the same person. The only person you're in competition with is the person you were yesterday. That's it. That's the only one. Nobody else. So, and this evolutionary biology and psychology, our bodies and brains evolved best suited for a primitive environment no longer exist. Once we realize that, then you have to say, okay, I've got fat genes, I've got anger genes, I've got these genes. And so that's not working out. I think men are going to become extinct if us men don't figure this out soon because, if you read the selfish gene or any of these things, if the main thing for the man was to be strong and be aggressive and, fight for this and fight for that and mate with as many partners as you can, that'll push your genetics forward. And lo and behold, you find out apparently modern women don't want us to mate with them every time we see a cute girl. So, and you're saying, well, then why do I have these genes? And actually, neuroscience has shown the area in a man's brain called sexual pursuit is a lot bigger than in the female brain. It's nobody's fault. I would say, well, I didn't invent this, don't shoot the messenger. So evolutionary biology and psychology goes back millions and billions of years, and everyone who struggles with their weight expects a little sympathy about, well, my fat genes, that's not fair. I know some people eat like crazy and they never put on a pound. That's not fair. But all these evolutionary biological things aren't fair. But I think men are going to really we're going to have to up our game. With all the gun violence, there was an article in today's New York Times about how many more murders men commit than women. It's just astronomically different. If we don't get our act together, men, women are going to outlaw us altogether. As soon as they can make clones of themselves, we're done. We're out. So we need to do a lot of work. So the other thing with ourselves, I mentioned the Stoicism and Buddhism. But this is an interesting point. This the yin and yang thing, the balance. This is actually a critical point. Most people don't make this. We'll talk about your brains for a second. You need to have high enough self-esteem to have the confidence to move forward. At the same time, the humility to avoid narcissism, solipsism, egotism, or you end up like Donald Trump. And so, but if you're too timid, a lot of women, rate themselves down too much. So my favorite quote, and I made this up and it's not even true, but it's still my favorite quote. We are all idiots savants. An idiot savant, like Rain Man, is someone who's got mental handicaps, but then has this one area of genius. They can come up with dates, thousands of years. They can sit at a piano. They can do these crazy things, right? Idiot savants. So we're all idiot savants, which means even those of you who say, have imposter syndrome, well, I'm not that smart. You have an area of genius in there somewhere. And even those of you who say, oh, I'm really smart, the answer is no, you've got big stupid areas there. They're all there. So you want to do both at the same time. The yin and yang, everything about psychology and philosophy is it's both. It's not one or the other, it's both. So every time you pat yourself on the back, good job, Robert. Well, you don't have to use Robert if you like. But if you pat yourself on the back, good moment, you have to also say, but you really dropped the ball on that other thing, this balance. So another quote I like, nobody should know their age or their IQ. I talk to a lot of senior groups all the time. So I say, you should say you're old enough to be responsible, but not so old to start making excuses. And also, you're smart enough to deserve a place at the table, but not so smart everybody has to agree with you. So just learn that balance. Stoicism is making a big comeback lately. If you go on the internet, you'll see a million video lectures about modern Stoicism, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, most of you probably, how many people ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy? Okay, well, good. So, and this is critical, I think. I don't hear people talk about this much, but what I like about this is this. So those who've never looked at these things, the thought was you start out at the most basic level, meeting your basic needs, food, water, warmth, and sleep. And it's only once you get there that you can try to move up to security and forming some sort of a stable environment. And once you have that, then you can actually try to make friends and relationships, move up a little higher. And then if you do that, you could even go, it's okay to have a little esteem in there. If you get the reputation, I'm the best carpenter in my village, or I'm the best pie maker, or whatever, if it helps you be successful and motivates you, that's okay. And then if you're really good, try to go to the next level up, self-actualization. Try to be the Army quote, be all that you can be. And then Maslow later added this expanded hierarchy. He said self-transcendence. Can you actually be so? You've done what you need to do. You've proved yourself, whatever. You're now this, master Zen guy who sits there. You're the Dalai Lama. You're no longer focusing at all on yourself. You're just looking at the community and saying, what can I do to make everybody here healthier or better? And so I throw this out just to, is aspirational to say, if you're trying to think of, should I have a life plan? Should I have a meaning in life? What is my goal? My goal would be to say, I want to see how far up the ladder I can go. That's a goal. And so you should consider that. Because I think a lot of people, lack a goal, lack a meaning, lack a value. And so you see that, somebody who didn't have much money, he wins the lottery. So they buy 3 houses. They've never had it. They buy 3 houses, way too much food, whatever. They're not even tempted to go a little higher up the ladder. And so this is sort of the only hierarchy. I start out and said, don't judge each other. Don't say, she's prettier than she is, he's smarter than this, that, etc. Try not to form hierarchies and ranking yourself and each other. But I think it's fair to rank this, to say these things are better. And you can make that judgment. And then the final one, an exercise you could do to improve yourself, like a little thought experiment. There's a lot of movies about going back into the past and fixing all the mistakes you made and doing a better job. Lots of movies like that. And so consider, what is your obligation or responsibility for your previous self, your current self, and your future self? And it sounds wacky, but the truth is, the current self is the only person who can do anything, right? But when you think about your previous self, how should you think about that person? Well, one, you can't fix them. You could almost say, well, I'm glad I'm not that guy. Maybe I'm not even responsible. That guy's come and gone. But you can learn something from his bad moments and say, yeah, Robert, that wasn't your best. And then you can take inspiration and gratitude the times you did step up. And the point I'm making here is, you want to generate motions that are healing and good for you. If you have dry skin, you want to moisturize it. If you want to become a better person, you want to be inspired and encouraged by the times you did something good. And you want to take note when you did something bad and say, okay, how can I avoid doing that in the future? But you do not beat yourself up. Everybody's heard of the golden rule, do unto others as you would want done to you. But you may not have heard of the reverse golden rule, which says don't say or do to yourself what you wouldn't say or do to somebody else. So if you had a friend who was struggling, you wouldn't say, you're such a loser, boy, and you're fat, and you're ugly, and you're this. You wouldn't say that. You say it to yourself. People do that all the time. So the reverse golden rule, because the whole point is, if you want to become better, you have to be kind to yourself. You got to take all this stuff, learn from it, be inspired by it, and make yourself better. So an old classic thing, you cannot go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. So think of that in terms of those big 3 things. There's so much information out there. There's quantum mechanics and complexity theory, and the evolutionary psychology and existentialism. And is there a role for religion? Do we need more religion? No. Is it good to dump religion? You got all these pieces. You have political polarization. You have technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You want to be that cork floating along. You're very calm. You have your brain open. Everybody who I meet, I try to say to myself, well, what can I learn from this person? What can he teach me? And is there an opportunity I might be able to help this person, cheer them up? So if you start forming that sort of, there's a popular word that went around called Schadenfreude. And you see these words, Schadenfreude means taking pleasure in somebody else's misfortune. And so there's a long history of that. If you Google Schadenfreude, they have a bunch of funny pictures. So you want to replace Schadenfreude with Freudenfreude, which means when somebody has some good news, you want to be happy for them. So it's all a mindset. One final comment, there's something called the growth mindset. Carol Dweck, I love her stuff. And so if you can teach children a growth mindset, they'll do so much better. And Carol Dweck is a serious scientist. And so she doesn't throw out theories. She then throws out tons of data, one study after the next study after the next study. So serious science. So I think I've said enough then. So we'll stop and see if there's any questions or comments or booing or heckling. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. All right, so we have time for a few questions, and I will walk the mic to you if you have questions for Dr. Miller. Here you go, Miles.
Thank you. So my question is, how do you balance self-preservation with also like self-sacrifice? Because I feel like one of the often things I struggle with in college is finding out how to balance my day-to-day life, but also contributing to the things around me. And I feel like that's hard to do when you're younger because you're so brainwashed into thinking that money and getting a job is everything and that all life is about your surroundings being happy. But like you talked about earlier, like how your surroundings influence you in ways that you may not be aware of. So like how do you balance that dilemma of preserving yourself and like keeping your life great, but also giving back?
Yeah, society still sort of tells you, like if doctors, why do doctors get burnt out? Because they say, well, patients come first. If you have any time left, you should do, family comes second, and you yourself come in last. And so if you drew a Venn diagram, you would say, well, here's all of the world, everybody, here's people, here's little old me. Again, if you're Donald Trump, you draw a Venn diagram. I'm all there is, and there is something inside and something. Okay, so when you're looking at yourself and people are trying to take advantage and you're saying, well, they say turn the other cheek, I should be good, I should be doing all this. When do I get my chance at the, swing of the bat and all that, this sense of balance. And so you almost have to look at it and say, if your mother was there or some, neutral party who would say, no, you deserve something as well. So you almost have to invoke a neutral third party in your mind and saying, I want to be fair, but I need to be fair to myself as well. And some of these dilemmas I said about, compensation for previous sins of others and all these, that really, as far as what is fair or moral, that has to be a societal. We have to sit down as a community and figure out what is fair. I mean, people on taxes say, I think the rich should pay their fair share. Well, how do you define fair? And so we need a very calm, unemotional sit down with that. But giving everything away of yours, if you said, I'm such a moral, decent person, I will take this shirt off my back, I will give it to random strangers, I will do all this, I'm getting, moral points somewhere in the world. Is that, from evolutionary standpoint, no, you still need to survive. So, you don't need to feel guilty. But society, you may be in a community where it says you're supposed to give. Women still get taken advantage of in our society because it's assumed if you have elderly, sick parents, the daughters have to step up and do it, and you can say, well, I'm a man, I'm not any good, I'm busy with my job, I got to play golf today anyway. And the poor woman gets stuck. And most women, realize they're being victimized all the time and taken advantage of constantly because other people will make them feel guilty. So you do need to stand up for yourself. So it's that sense of balance. You almost need to say, if my best friend was in the room, would he say, hey, you're getting taken advantage of? So you need to invoke that sometimes. And you need to find your own sense of fairness and morality. I talk a lot about people who are heavy about the idea of intermittent fasting and skipping meals and having your feeding window down to a small time interval. And somebody will say, well, you skip breakfast. They say breakfast is the most important meal. And I said, who said that? I said, that was Kellogg's, the guy who invented breakfast cereal. He said that. He was a nut job. They made a movie out of Kellogg's. Why would you take advice from that guy? And of course, again, we all have cloudy thinking. Well, people say this, and everybody says, and people still do that all the time. They use what's called the royal we. Well, we as Americans believe X. Whenever somebody says that, I say, well, no. You can speak for yourself, and you may be able to speak for a group if you want to footnote what you just said. This is the old Lone Ranger story that he and Tonto were best friends and buddies. But one day they're out, and this war tribe of Indians just has them surrounded. It's totally hopeless. And Lone Ranger says to Tonto, well, what are we going to do now? And he says, what do you mean we, paleface? So at some point, he's peeling back and saying, don't use the royal we. I'm kind of thinking right now we're each going our own way here. So I guess what I'm saying is even if you're not a language expert, words really matter. So we all probably need to be more careful and thoughtful on exactly how are you describing these words. Fair, equity, anything. Woke is a popular word. That the word has now been used by so many people for so many different purposes that all the meaning has been sucked out of that word. So it doesn't mean anything to me. If somebody wants to use the word woke or something, I would say, well, first define how you're using that word, and then I can tell you whether I agree or disagree, etc. So language is important, syntax is important, semantics is important, this whole field of neuroscience. See, I find all this interesting because I keep thinking, oh, well, this answers that, and this fits in there, and again, I know for young people who still have more, they're overloaded with stuff you have to do. To say, take an afternoon off and add all these other little things. I know it sounds like, useless information or advice. You can't possibly do that. But think about that in the back of your mind. Try to be more comprehensive.
We have time for one more question. All right, feeling inspired? Feeling ready for the Friday? Oh, good. All right. Well, I hope that you have taken Dr. Miller's talk into account as well as his slideshow. If you're willing to share your PowerPoint, that would be wonderful as well.
Yeah, can I just
Excellent.
leave it on the thing and you can upload anybody who wants
I
the
would
pictures?
love that. And
Yeah.
then obviously this is being recorded so you can watch it for more inspiration too. So once again, let's thank Dr. Miller for his time and wisdom.
Thank you.